Welcome to MTA International Studios in Silver Spring, Maryland for the taping of Open Forum. Today we discuss, can we live without racial biases? There's plenty of studies that have discussed this topic. For instance, there was a study that showed that when they submitted the same resume to various people around the country with different names, the Caucasian names got a 50% more likely callback than African American or other racial names. So there's all these biases that exist. Today we're going to talk about how do they happen, why do they happen, and what can we do about them. Today we have three great panelists with us here today. On my right is Christopher Khalid-Janeh, who is a master's student in industrial organization psychology, as well as a human capital consultant in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And he's married and expecting. He loves to play video games and a Baltimore Ravens fan. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Next, we have Habib Mohammed Shafiq Jr., a middle school social studies teacher. He's married and raising 2 children, and he loves gardening and cooking. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here, Mac.
Next, we have Irfan Ahmed Al-Adin, who's a medical doctor in Long Island, New York. He's married with 5 children and loves to travel. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So Habib, frame this issue for us. What is a racial bias, and how does it happen?
Mac, I think that's a very profound question. Racial bias is a prejudice for or against a group or a person, and usually that bias is unfavorable. And what makes racial bias so extremely negative is how individuals for or against leverage that bias in favor of or against a particular person or group.
And how does it exhibit itself? You're a medical doctor. I mean, do medical professionals react to patients differently based on race? Could that happen?
Sometimes they do, and sometimes there is a basis for it. For example, certain communities, for African American community in particular, responds better to diuretic type hypertensive medicines that make the urine leave the body. They react better, and Caucasians do better with ACE inhibitors or medications that work on the kidneys to change the vessel structure. So there is definitely a basis for this, but at the same time, discrimination is unfounded. So
let's take off but the bias. I mean, does bias exist in the workplace and how we service individuals? Does that happen in the profession?
Absolutely.
Well, how does it exhibit itself?
I think that you'll see certain communities are boycotted against or not called in for certain positions as much as other communities. And this is a bias. Of course, it can be in a favor. For example, if you're looking for an attorney, they say get a Jewish attorney. So that could be a positive bias if you're looking for certain attorneys.
And Mac, we have biases in schools. For an example, a young black American, he could come into a classroom where there's predominantly white students. He's sagging his pants. He may have a hat on backwards, etc. And your first indication of this is going to be a problem. This is going to be perhaps a low-performing student. And you turn around and you have a young Nelson Mandela sitting right there sagging his pants. So it happens even in the classroom, even in schools.
So Christopher, a lot of these biases end up coming across in favor of Caucasians. I mean, how do you see this? I mean, is this something that's innate, as simple as, well, incarceration rates are disproportionately higher for African Americans versus Caucasians because they're committing more crimes? Is it as simple as that?
I don't think so. I mean, if you look at statistics, there's no question that crime happens equally. It's a fact. They've shown it again and again. You can look at, there's Pew Research out here. And when you look at the numbers, there's not a difference in the amount of crime that's done by any one ethnicity. It comes down to how they're treated as far as the legal system goes. What are the punishments? I mean, you will see if you take 2 people, if you take one white guy, one black guy, you put them into court for the exact same crime, black guy is almost every single time going to get a more stringent charge. And in a lot of cases, you'll have a white person that is actually allowed to walk out of the courtroom on their own recognizance, where someone that is not white would be remanded.
I mean, let me ask you a question. In education, you know, they call it the achievement gap, where Caucasian students perform 30% better than African American and Hispanic students, and they say that there's this achievement gap. It's 30 percentage points in most things. How does that happen? I mean, aren't teachers teaching the same way in front of the same classroom?
No doubt that they are, Mac. But and this is a very interesting and complicated question. The simple answer is that teachers are human beings as well, and teachers oftentimes can transfer their bias across to a student, sometimes typically without even knowing it. And I'd like to jump back to my colleague's point here about crime and those particular things. Recently, President Obama appointed a new FBI director, and he gave a startling news conference not too long ago in the States, where he simply said, look, that these biases exist, and what we meaning the law enforcement community have to do a better job is when we see these people of color, that we can begin to see them without this jaundice, without this bias. So whether we're teachers, whether we're cops, whether we're or whatever we are, that bias exists. And in talking to my other colleagues who are teachers, a lot of times they have these preconceived notions about certain students based on their name, based on what they look like, based on what they wear, based on their parents. And a lot of times the child can internalize that, receive that, and merely shut down. So this bias is something that we all have to work on. We all have it. But I think what we don't do a good enough job here in the States, Mac, is two things. We don't do a good enough job of talking about it honestly, and we don't call to attention those individuals that leverage it negatively to harm others.
So Irfan, tell me about the bias. It exists in religion as well. I mean, there's a lot of biases in the United States of America around Muslims. So what does that look like?
That is true. In fact, we've seen this case here in North Carolina where 3 were killed by an individual who was upset. Maybe because of their background, they were thinking that they're terrorists, or because they're Arab in background. But the Holy Quran is quite the opposite. It says that, O ye who believe, O ye men, surely we have created you in tribes and sub-tribes that you may recognize one another. In akramakum andallahi atqakum, that the best among you is he who is most righteous. So the Holy Quran says that we made you into many groups, but this only so you recognize one another. The thing that is most important is taqwa, righteousness. And that's what we have to move towards.
So I mean, you infuse a lot of religions. So those that don't believe in Islam, most religions would not promote racial bias, I would argue. But I guess my question to you more is around the biases against, you know, I mean, there's 3 people being killed in Chapel Hill is one example. There's a lot of biases against Muslims out there. For instance, they're 2% of the population, but the discrimination suits are 25% of that happens. So what's going on there? How do biases develop?
Well, we've had some instances between the September 11 attacks and many other terrorist attacks, as we know. These only feed into these biases. We know that the vast majority of Muslims do not want to commit any terrorist act. In fact, we want to save people from terrorist acts or any other danger. In fact, that's what the Holy Quran teaches, that the Muslims were created for the protection of the churches and the protection of the synagogues and for the protection of the temples. And the last is the mosques. So we, as Muslims, are here for the benefit of humanity. Yet, because unfortunately some villains among the Muslim community, or call themselves Muslims, have basically hijacked the faith, now there's bias against, unfortunately, all the Muslims.
And is bias okay? Is it okay to have bias when you see, if there's a disproportionate group within a community that's doing certain things, isn't it okay to have the bias?
I don't see it as okay, because you have to judge each individual. You can't judge one person based on a stereotype that you have.
Right, Christopher.
So a couple things. One, I think that when we talk about, I think there's a value in having, a rule of thumb that we say, okay, well, certain things in life, we say, I know that this happens here, this happens there. When it comes to people, you just can't do that. You can't say that
Tell us
one
about your personal
specific
experience.
I've grown up with diverse friends. I work in very diverse, locations, and all of my jobs I've had people that are from all over the world. But I do know workplaces where that's not the case.
But
And
your wife is not Caucasian either, right?
no, my wife is from, and her family are from Pakistan. We've had situations where we went on for the Thanksgiving holiday. We went to a restaurant, and the manager, my father-in-law, who has a very thick accent, he definitely is not white, and he's standing there at the counter trying to talk with her. She gets very annoyed, and basically writes him off. What she doesn't realize is he's paying for the other 15 people standing in line, and I walk up and magically she's happy again. And it was very distinct. We watched it happen. It happened right in front of us. And I said something to her, and I said, I'm not really sure I understand why he's standing here in front of you and you're giving him a hard time, but you're happy to see me. Like, what happened here?
Mac, I really think this is a good point, but this also goes to a larger question that you were raising: is bias okay? I think that the thing that makes bias so detrimental is how people leverage the bias. For an example, here in the States, if you pull up into a parking lot, the closest prime parking spots are reserved for individuals who have handicaps.
Right.
Now, that's a bias. And that bias is for those individuals who are handicapped. Yet we don't see that as negative, because we see that as fair and that this is something that is purposeful. What makes, and I think bias is in all of us. What we have to do is what I happen to be a practicing Ahmadi Muslim, a sect of Islam who follows Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian, and being born a Muslim, I was constantly bombarded with all kinds of biases because I grew up in a black Baptist neighborhood. And my father was a staunch Lincoln Republican. So I had like this double minority thing. I was black and I was not a black Muslim, and my father was a Republican. So when we see those 4 parking spots, we don't say, oh my God, this is terrible. These people, they get preference. This is affirmative action. We see it as positive. What makes the bias? Goes back to our friend's comment about what the Holy Quran says. It's that these things are being used. These 4 parking spots remind us that these individuals have a certain thing, and we should be respectful of that. And if we can begin to look at each other with the same type of situation, we can get beyond that.
So that's a great point. So Irfan, how does society develop bias? I mean, bias happens for a reason. Isn't there a good rhyme and reason for a bias? I mean, I love what Habib said about positive biases, but there must be a reason for bias. I mean, if enough people do a certain thing, you develop your biases. So how does society develop the bad biases that we're talking about? These positive biases is a great example of why, in some cases, bias is good.
And certain communities have different qualities that separate them. There are certain qualities among Caucasians and people of African descent and people of Indian descent. Each has their own qualities, and whether they be positive and they be negative. Unfortunately, some communities will focus against those negative qualities of other communities. And when they harp and they focus on those stereotypes develop and they get passed on. And that is what we are here to stop, because if the best among you is he who is most righteous, we should be focusing on each other's piety to get strength. Now, for example,
Go ahead.
So I want to kind of bring in another point here. So there's research that has been done in classrooms where if you take 2 sets of kids and you tell a teacher and you say, well, this group has been tested as being much higher in intelligence and they're going to be successful, and you take this group over here and you say they're not, the teacher will not intentionally, but will subconsciously treat them differently. That same premise in social psychology goes over when we talk about the bias that happens from an ethnic standpoint. If a teacher believes that children of African American descent, if children from Latino descent, something are going to perform less, they will not give them the harder problems, they will not challenge them, and they will not do the things to help them to be more successful.
But take me to, why do racial biases develop? And it seems like the Caucasian community gets a disproportionate share of favoritism through those biases as well, and they
Absolutely.
benefit from them.
Absolutely.
Like
And
your
I don't-
example in the restaurant.
And I don't think there's any doubt about it. I mean, I'm much more aware now as I've gotten older of the white privilege. There's no question about it. It exists. It's there. It's the elephant in the room. Nobody wants to talk about it, but it's the truth. And I can go into a job, and if it's me and there's a black candidate, there's a pretty good chance that I'm going to get the job, purely by the color of my skin. It happens from a historical perspective. You know, we've talked
But
about
why
this.
does it happen, Chris?
People, they form this in-group, out-group. I'm better, I'm more superior because you're less. And that started from, let's go back to the beginning of America. How did we get a lot of the different ethnicities that are here, right? You have African Americans brought over as slaves. You have Chinese brought over similarly as slaves, or that came over for work and ended up working on railroads until they died. I mean, you've got things that happened in the past that grew to where we are today. This
a
didn't
great
just
point.
happen overnight.
That's a great point. Habib, go ahead, real quick.
Yeah, Mac, to your question, and I'm really feeling you wanted to get at the essence of this. I think the root of bias is ignorance and fear, but it's interesting how in America we can look at teams, just take the American style football. You could have really highly charged individuals who are admittedly racist, but yet they will be pulling for a particular team that has predominantly black players on it. Why? Because they know the San Diego Chargers. This is their team. This is their guys. So they don't see them as these other kinds of individuals because they have embraced them and they have knowledge of the team and they don't have a fear. And I think it's rooted in that. So how is it that
ignorance drives it?
Ignorance drives this, but white individuals who predominantly with their dollars and wealth support these professional teams just thumbs down. How is it that they could have these very strong things outside of the team arena?
So why? Why is that? Why can't they have it?
I think it's based on those two things, lack of fear and lack of knowledge. They embrace this team. This is their team. These are their guys. They know them. They have an affinity for them. And so they relax all of these things that make them automatically fearful of this African American who's not a member of the team.
They don't
see
see
a
skin.
uniform. They see something else.
At that point, that they
The
deliver.
uniform
there's no skin.
unites them.
Yeah, it's not.
So Irfan, let me ask you this: is this unique to America, or does this happen in every country, and it's not disproportionate to America?
Well, it can be universal, but unfortunately, this country we have a major problem. And I was going to mention also that there may be a religious basis for this bias as well. You know that Noah had the sons, Shem, Japheth, and Ham. And when the nakedness of Noah was not covered, this is taught in the churches originally, if you look at South Africa, that because the leader of the African community there, the father, did not cover the nakedness, all the people of Africa are cursed. And that was taught. And that is the basis of apartheid in South Africa, and from which Nelson Mandela came and fought against that.
Absolutely.
So
Help me
there's even a
understand, what,
biblical basis there.
what does that
Genesis.
analogy mean?
Well, it says that you have the leaders of the African community, the Asian community, and the Caucasian community. And these were the three sons, Japheth, Ham, and Shem. And because the other sons covered, but not the son from the African community, all the people of Africa would be, God forbid, cursed forever. This is the basis of apartheid and the subjugation of people of
So
color.
are you saying that the Africans are predestined towards racial bias?
This is the biblical teaching. I mean, it's not the true biblical teaching. It's a
an
perversion
interpretation,
of it. It's
okay.
an interpretation or a perversion of it. But there is a basis, and it's unfortunate that this is the tragedy here, that it is the basis of all of racism in the world.
But let me stay with Irfan for a second. So, but help me understand. Is this an American issue, or does this happen in the United Kingdom and Germany and other countries as much as it happens? Pakistan. I mean, I can name any country. Does it happen in this manner in other countries as well?
In America, I think we have a great deal of racism. It's tremendous. But
Tell me
when you
about the
go
other
back-
countries.
But also, you know, for example, in the UK, I think that there's lesser degrees than you see in America. Unfortunately, we have a lot of polarization in America because the people from Africa who came over as slaves. And that has to be remembered. They did not come over on their own volition. They were brought over on ships, and according to Leonard Jeffries, maybe 200 million died crossing over.
200 million died?
Yes,
crossing?
easy.
It is said.
Yes, absolutely.
How many made it?
that it was only a few million who made it, and they've increased in size since then. But about 200 million died. Leonard Jeffries from City University of New York has quoted this number.
That's scary.
Mac, we need to be careful too, not to smudge race and bias, because, for an example, I visited Pakistan 5 times as a young man, and my brothers, my fellow Ahmadi brothers in Pakistan, they are the same color. They are essentially the same tribe of individuals who are in Pakistan, yet there is a very strong bias against them because of their beliefs, not skin color, not tribe. So we need to, bias is the hammer. Race perhaps could be a factor. Your ethnicity factor, who you believe in, if you believe in different aspects of Khatam Nabiyyin or Seal of the Prophets. So
people are biased against Mormons as well. And
exactly. So
irrespective of-
my point is race. Dr. Saab here has hit it right on the head. But race and bias, we need to really keep a distinction here, because race is something else, and bias is that leverage in which people can use to incite hate.
Let's transition to solutions. We have a few minutes left here.
Sure.
Some people overcompensate. You know, I mean, white privilege that you use. You know, so you try to say, no, I'm not going to take this job. Give it to a lesser candidate. So that there's the other extreme of that as well. But help me understand that. How do we help our communities? First as our communities, and then we can talk about individual actions as well. How do we overcome racial bias?
I mean, I think one of the big things we heard was education. It's not
You
seeing
can educate
other
out of racial bias.
I think that there's a lot of that. It is a matter of not seeing other people as being this mysterious other, right? When you start to learn about other cultures, other people, other religions, those things, all of a sudden you're like, wow, this is pretty interesting. They're human beings like I am. Oh wait, we're not that different. Oh, we you know, I like this or I don't like that. So then you learn the things that you like within that.
Absolutely.
But you also learn the things that you say, well, maybe I'm not okay with that, but I don't have to do that, but I still like these things. We can connect on that. It creates connections. That breaks down that bias.
So let me ask you a specific question here. African Americans,
Yes.
there's affirmative action.
Yes.
They sometimes get a disproportionate share at times as well. Is it fair to always play that, or do they work just as hard and there really is a bias?
Absolutely, they work as hard, and I reject, and I think statistics would also reject that notion that just because there is affirmative action that African Americans are either somehow not qualified or they get an overextended share. Like I mentioned about those 4 prime parking spots.
Right.
Or why is it, for an example, you take the University of Alabama, and at one time they had a racist governor, George Wallace. He said segregation then, segregation now, segregation forever, and that no N, but he used the N word, will ever come to this university, essentially. Now if you look at the University of Alabama, they have extraordinary black football players. Now, why do those football players go to the University of Alabama? We could argue that that's a form of affirmative action. Why is it predominantly these individuals who are black are on these sports teams? But so my point essentially is this, is that the solution is not in anything other than what we have to begin to do is to embrace each other, get to learn each other. Why does a person become a fan of a particular team? Because they begin to embrace their
What
ideas.
can African Americans do to solve this problem?
First of all, African Americans, like any African Americans, are human beings. And I don't think that it's just merely an African American problem.
Sure. But the bias is against them.
But the bias is against them, and think about it. If I were to reverse that, what can Ahmadis throughout
of the
Ahmadiyya Muslims of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community do to change the mind of the government of Pakistan?
Right.
I mean, what do you have to do? We have love for all, hateful for none. What's a stronger magnet against hate and against bias than love? And yet we are challenged in Pakistan to get people love. So we have to be careful in looking at that.
What about the argument that I know I have to work 110%.
Yes, let me
while
give you an
someone else
example.
would work
I was
100%.
in Qadian, and Qazi Muhammad Barakat, who was a
Qadian is a city in India.
Qadian is a city in India, and there was a gentleman who was an ambassador to New York, and I asked him for some advice. His name was Qazi Muhammad Barakat. I said, "Sir, I'm on my way back to the States. Give me some advice." He said, "Okay, Habib, I'll give you this." And he didn't even flinch. He said, "Every morning you have 3 things against you." I said, "Really?" He said, "You are black, you are a Muslim, and you are an Ahmadi Muslim. And every morning when you wake up, Habib, you have to be better at all 3 of those things. I'll see you when I get back to New York." And I was in my 20s when he said this to me. You are black, you are a Muslim, and you are an Ahmadi Muslim. You've got 3 strikes every morning in America when you wake up. So I'm not saying that what do blacks have to do? What do Ahmadis have to do? What we have to do is to display love and to display it in such a way that love will conquer this, and to be patient and not feed into the stereotypes. Now granted, I have a lot of African Americans, including my own family members, who feed into certain kinds of stereotypes. So we can't feed into the stereotypes, and we have to continue to display love for all and hatred for none.
Thank you.
I agree with that. I give you an example of my grandmother. She came in 1949. My grandfather came in 1946. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, none here at that time. In fact, the countries didn't exist at that time. But back then, I remember more recently, she'd make some great turkey. She'd make some great vegetables, collard greens, some great jams. I said, "How'd you learn to make this? It has no connection with biryani and halim." She said, back then, the whole community was us, the imam, the Murabi Sahib, and the community was pretty much all African American. And they taught me how to make these, and that's why I make them so well.
And now tell me, those are great examples, by the way, but help me understand biases against Muslims. What can Muslims do to help dispel, just like we talked about African Americans, or what can we do to help dispel biases against Muslims that exist?
Well, as Muslims, we have to first teach the true teachings of Islam, which are love. If any person is killed unjustly, it is as if all of humanity is lost. And if you save a life, it is as if you have saved all of humanity. We need to, as Muslims, save lives. We need to go out there and give blood. We need to give blood. We need to do the soup kitchens. We need to adopt the highways. We need to do those things that show the community, the greater, as Americans and or as worldwide, and in UK and in the entire world, that we are here for the benefit of humanity. As it says that in the Holy Quran, that kuntum khayra ummatin, you are created for the benefit of humanity.
Yes. Christopher, real quick, can you? A lot of this is what can you do as a Caucasian male living in America where you benefit from all this? And one of the things you've done is you have interracial marriage. I mean, and that's an example of you see both sides of the fence so well. But what can Caucasian Americans do, Caucasian around the world do to help dispel some of these biases?
I mean, and I think it comes down to a number of things, right? So first of all, it's demonstrating that you understand that you're a human being and that everyone around you is a human being. Yes. And it's getting to know people. It's reaching out and saying, "Hey, why don't we go and have a lunch together? Why don't we get to know each other? Why don't we go do something together so that I can," it's connecting instead of saying, "Well, I don't know this person," or maybe, I've met people who said.
That sounds too easy.
That's the problem, is that it is so simple, people miss it. It's simply just reaching out a hand and saying, "Hey, how are you? Shake my hand." It's a matter of saying, "Hi." That's the first step. If you start with hi, the next piece will happen. But people are a lot of times they're afraid, or they just say, "Well, I don't know what I have in common with this person."
Corporate America, there's a lot of biases as well. You work in corporate America. How do you dispel that? The guy sitting right next to you could be another race, and you get all the benefits, and you're trying to climb up the corporate ladder. You got to keep going.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the things I do is I always look for opportunities where I can pay it forward to somebody else. I came from a poor background. I came from where I had to work my way up, and so I know that. So trying to sit there and say, anybody that's struggling under any circumstance for any reason, why not? If I'm in a better place and I can help you, that's my responsibility as a human being and as an Ahmadi Muslim. Like, that is my responsibility as a servant to humanity to do that.
Mac,
and everybody has that responsibility.
Mac, the opposite of this bias is prejudice.
That's true. That's a great point. With that closing thought, we are out of time, but a great show on racial biases. The opposite of bias is prejudice. There's lots of solutions. It seems like love conquers a lot of these solutions. Education conquers a lot of these solutions. Thank you for joining us on Open Forum. Hope to see you next time here.